Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into one of the most complex chapters in American history,
Oh, yeah,
the Vietnam War.
definitely.
You sent over this lecture focusing on U.S. involvement across 4 presidencies,
Right.
starting with Eisenhower and ending with Nixon's attempts to extricate the U.S. from the conflict.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story full of twists and turns, shifting strategies and ultimately a failure to achieve those initial objectives.
Yeah.
What's really striking, I think, is how each president, from Eisenhower to Nixon, approached this conflict and how their decisions shaped the course of the war.
Right. It's so easy to get lost in all the dates and military jargon.
Oh, yeah,
But we're here to break it all down for you.
absolutely.
Make sure you walk away with a clear understanding of this pivotal period and uncover those aha moments along the way.
For sure.
So let's start in the 1950s with Eisenhower.
Okay.
What was the driving force behind U.S. involvement in Vietnam at that time?
Well, the Cold War was at its peak, and the U.S. was deeply entrenched in the domino theory. This theory essentially posited that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow suit.
Right.
Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, was a key area of concern.
So the U.S. was essentially trying to prevent the spread of communism in the region.
Exactly.
But the lecture mentions that the U.S. initially supported the French in their fight against the Viet Minh.
Right.
Why support a colonial power?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The U.S. saw Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Minh, as a communist threat and prioritized containing communism over supporting Vietnamese independence.
Okay.
They poured billions of dollars in military aid into the French effort, but ultimately the French lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Which led to the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel.
Yes.
So that's when the U.S. really started backing South Vietnam.
Exactly.
Okay.
Eisenhower saw Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, as the best hope against a communist takeover. He viewed Diem as a crucial ally in the fight against communism, despite the fact that Diem's regime was, to put it mildly, authoritarian.
Hold on. So the U.S. was propping up a dictator in the name of fighting communism.
Right.
That seems a bit contradictory, don't you think?
It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But during the Cold War, the U.S. often prioritized anti-communism over promoting democracy,
Right.
which sometimes backfired.
Yeah.
And the lecture suggests that this lack of focus on democratic reforms in South Vietnam actually created instability.
Okay.
It alienated many Vietnamese and laid the groundwork for future conflict.
That's fascinating. It seems like the very strategy the U.S. employed to fight communism might have actually made the situation worse.
It's a complex issue,
Yeah.
and the lecture delves into that complexity.
Okay.
The U.S. was operating under the assumption that containing communism, even by supporting authoritarian regimes, was the best way to safeguard their interests.
Okay, so Eisenhower sets the stage with this controversial alliance with Diem.
Right.
Then Kennedy comes into office in 1961. What was his approach to Vietnam? Did he continue Eisenhower's policies?
Kennedy inherited a very difficult situation.
Right.
He decided to walk a tightrope,
Okay.
escalating U.S. involvement without fully committing to a large-scale war.
What does that mean in practical terms? What did this tightrope walk actually look like?
Well, under Kennedy, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam increased dramatically.
Okay.
They were sent to train the South Vietnamese army and help them combat the Viet Cong.
Wait, who are the Viet Cong? The lecture mentions them,
Right.
but I'm not entirely clear on their role.
The Viet Cong were a communist guerrilla force in South Vietnam
Okay.
that opposed Diem's regime and fought for reunification with the North.
Okay.
They were supported by North Vietnam and played a crucial role in the conflict.
Huh.
Think of them as a Southern resistance movement fighting against the U.S.-backed government in Saigon.
Got it.
Yeah.
So Kennedy's sending in advisors, but he's not committing to a full-blown war. But the lecture mentions that some of his decisions had unintended consequences.
It did.
Can you give us an example?
One example is the Strategic Hamlet Program.
Okay.
The idea was to relocate villagers into fortified communities, to isolate the Viet Cong and provide them with greater security.
Right.
However, it ended up alienating the rural population, disrupting their traditional way of life, and pushing some towards the communists.
So the program designed to protect villagers from the Viet Cong actually ended up pushing them towards the Viet Cong.
That's right.
Wow.
It's a classic example of how even Well-intentioned policies can backfire when you don't fully understand the local context and the needs of the people you're trying to help.
Yeah.
And then there's the use of Agent Orange and napalm.
Yeah, the lecture mentions those.
Yeah,
Weren't they meant to defoliate forests and disrupt enemy supply lines?
that was the intent.
Oh, yeah.
Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide, was used to defoliate jungles and expose Viet Cong hiding places. Napalm, a flammable gel, was used to burn vegetation and create fire breaks.
Right.
However, both had devastating long-term health and environmental consequences.
So a short-term tactical advantage with long-term horrific consequences.
Yes,
That's a tough pill to swallow.
it is.
It seems like Kennedy was trying to find a middle ground,
Yeah.
but his policies, while not as aggressive as later presidents, still had a profound impact on Vietnam.
They did.
This sets the scene for Johnson, who takes office after Kennedy's assassination.
Yes.
Before we jump into Johnson's presidency, though, I think it's important to step back and understand something.
Okay.
This lecture mentions how the Viet Cong were supported by North Vietnam.
Right.
Could you elaborate on the relationship between the two?
Certainly.
There
The
it is.
Viet Cong, as I mentioned earlier, were a communist guerrilla force operating in South Vietnam.
Right.
They received significant support from North Vietnam, both in terms of supplies and manpower. They used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths and roads that ran through Laos and Cambodia, to transport troops and supplies from North Vietnam to the south.
So it was more than just ideological support.
Oh, yeah.
They were actively aiding the Viet Cong in their fight against the South Vietnamese government and the U.S.
Absolutely. The North Vietnamese government saw the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule as a primary goal, and they were willing to commit substantial resources to achieve that goal.
Okay.
The Viet Cong served as their proxy force in the South, waging a guerrilla war against a much larger and better equipped enemy. Think of it this way. The North Vietnamese were the puppet masters, and the Viet Cong were the puppets, skillfully maneuvering to undermine the U.S.-backed government in South Vietnam.
Okay, I think that clarifies things a lot. So with this clearer understanding of the dynamics at play in Vietnam, let's move on to Johnson.
All right.
How did his approach to the war differ from Kennedy's?
Well, that's where things take a dramatic turn. Under Johnson, the Vietnam War escalated significantly, transforming from limited U.S. involvement to a full-scale war.
This is where things get really interesting.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
The lecture talks about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which basically gave Johnson a blank check to escalate the war.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident is still debated by historians.
Right.
The official account was that North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked 2 U.S. Navy destroyers. Whether that's entirely accurate or not, it gave Johnson the political cover he needed to drastically increase U.S. involvement.
And escalate he did.
He did.
The lecture describes Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam.
Operation Rolling Thunder was one of the most intense aerial bombardments in history.
Wow.
The U.S. aimed to cripple North Vietnam's ability to support the Viet Cong in the south by targeting their infrastructure, supply lines, and military installations.
We're talking sustained aerial bombardment trying to, as you said, cripple the North's ability to wage war.
Yes.
But the lecture also points out a major turning point, the deployment of U.S. ground troops.
That's right.
Okay. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam.
Wow.
It became Johnson's War, as some historians call it,
Right.
marking a significant escalation of the conflict.
So Johnson goes from advisor to combatant.
He does.
What was the rationale behind deploying ground troops? Was the bombing not effective?
The bombing campaign did cause significant damage, but it didn't break the North Vietnamese will to fight.
Okay.
Nor did it stop the flow of men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Right.
Johnson and his advisors believed that ground troops were needed to directly engage the enemy, secure key areas, and ultimately force North Vietnam to negotiate a peace settlement.
But despite this massive military effort, the U.S. struggled to achieve its objectives, right?
They did.
The lecture highlights how the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army proved incredibly resilient and resourceful. They were fighting on their home turf, deeply committed to their cause, and masters of guerrilla warfare. The U.S. military, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to this kind of enemy in this kind of terrain.
So even with superior firepower, the U.S. was facing an enemy that was incredibly difficult to defeat.
That's right.
This brings us to Nixon,
Yes.
who takes office in 1969, with the U.S. deeply mired in a war that's looking increasingly unwinnable.
Right.
We'll dig into Nixon's presidency and the eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops in part 2 of this deep dive.
Stay tuned because Nixon's approach brings a whole new set of challenges and controversies to the Vietnam War story.
Definitely.
Nixon inherited a real mess in Vietnam. Public support for the war was dwindling, and the U.S. was searching for a way out. His solution, Vietnamization.
Okay, so what exactly does Vietnamization mean? Was it just a fancy way of saying we're pulling out?
Not exactly. It was more nuanced than that. Nixon's plan involved gradually withdrawing U.S. forces while simultaneously strengthening the South Vietnamese army. He wanted to equip and train them to take over the fight against the communists. The idea was to achieve peace with honor, as he famously put it, by allowing the South Vietnamese to determine their own fate.
That sounds like a pretty delicate balancing act, trying to wind down U.S. involvement without appearing to abandon South Vietnam. But the lecture mentions that Nixon didn't exactly pursue a purely peaceful path. He continued the bombing of North Vietnam and even expanded the war into Cambodia.
You're right, those actions certainly contradicted the idea of a peaceful resolution. Nixon's justification for the bombing was that it was necessary to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and pressure North Vietnam into negotiating a peace settlement. As for the expansion into Cambodia, his goal was to destroy Viet Cong and North Vietnamese bases that were using Cambodian territory as a sanctuary and staging ground for attacks on South Vietnam.
So he was escalating the war in some areas while trying to de-escalate in others. It seems like a bit of a mixed message, wouldn't you say?
It was definitely a complex strategy, and it sparked a lot of controversy both domestically and internationally. Many saw the bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country, as a dangerous expansion of the war that would further destabilize the region.
And let's not forget the massive protests back home. The lecture mentions the Kent State shootings, a tragic event that really highlights the level of anti-war sentiment in the U.S. at that time.
Absolutely. The expansion of the war into Cambodia was a turning point for many Americans. They saw it as evidence that Nixon was not serious about ending the war and was willing to sacrifice more lives for a cause that seemed increasingly lost.
So while Nixon was pursuing this aggressive military strategy, he was also making some interesting diplomatic moves. The lecture mentions détente with the Soviet Union and the opening of relations with China. How did those initiatives factor into the Vietnam equation?
Those were bold moves on Nixon's part, and they had a significant impact on the global landscape. Détente with the Soviet Union was a period of eased tensions and increased cooperation between the two superpowers. By opening relations with China, Nixon was also attempting to drive a wedge between China and North Vietnam.
So he was playing this multi-dimensional chess game, trying to reshape the geopolitical landscape while also waging war in Southeast Asia.
Exactly. He saw diplomacy and military force as intertwined strategies. By improving relations with the Soviet Union and China, he hoped to isolate North Vietnam diplomatically and gain leverage in the peace talks.
And ultimately, this approach led to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which officially ended U.S. involvement in the war.
Yeah.
So in a way, Nixon achieved what he set out to do.
On paper, yes. The Paris Peace Accords allowed the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Vietnam and declare peace with honor. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The accords didn't address the underlying political divisions in Vietnam. The fighting continued, and just 2 years later, in 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese.
So a temporary peace followed by a communist victory. It seems like the U.S. ultimately failed to achieve its objectives in Vietnam despite decades of involvement and massive expenditures of blood and treasure.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But it's important to understand why those strategies failed. The lecture points to several key factors.
Okay, let's dig into those. What were the main reasons why the U.S. couldn't achieve its goals in Vietnam?
The lecture highlights the consistent underestimation of the enemy. Time and time again, the U.S. misjudged the capabilities, the resolve, and the level of popular support enjoyed by both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army.
I guess it's easy to underestimate an enemy that doesn't fight like you expect them to. We talked earlier about how the Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, blending in with civilians and utilizing hit-and-run tactics.
Exactly. It was a completely different kind of warfare than the U.S. military was accustomed to. They were trained for conventional battles, big clashes with clearly defined front lines, but in Vietnam they were fighting a shadowy enemy that was incredibly adept at exploiting the jungle terrain and waging a war of attrition.
And as you mentioned earlier, the Viet Cong were backed by North Vietnam, so they had a steady supply of manpower and resources. The U.S. might have had superior firepower, but it was facing a determined and adaptable enemy that was deeply committed to its cause.
The political landscape in South Vietnam also played a crucial role in the U.S. failure. The lecture argues that the U.S. backed a series of governments that lacked popular support and were riddled with corruption.
So even if the U.S. had been able to defeat the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese militarily, would they have been able to create a stable and independent South Vietnam?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the problem. It's hard to win a war if you don't have the support of the people you're supposedly defending. The lack of political legitimacy in South Vietnam undermined the entire U.S. war effort. It made it difficult to build a sustainable, independent nation that could resist communist influence.
It sounds like a classic case of winning the battle but losing the war.
Exactly. The U.S. focused on military victory, but they failed to address the underlying political and social dynamics that were fueling the conflict. And then there's the reliance on conventional military tactics, which, as we've discussed, were largely ineffective against a guerrilla force like the Viet Cong.
We talked about the Strategic Hamlet program earlier, but there were also the massive bombing campaigns. The lecture mentions Operation Rolling Thunder, but it seems like there were multiple attempts to cripple North Vietnam through air power.
The U.S. dropped millions of tons of bombs on North Vietnam, but it didn't break their will to fight, and it caused immense civilian suffering. The bombing campaigns became a major point of contention both domestically and internationally. They raised serious ethical questions about the proportionality of force and the impact on innocent civilians.
And of course, there's the expansion of the war into Cambodia, which, as we've discussed, had disastrous consequences. It further destabilized the region, fueled anti-war sentiment in the U.S., and ultimately failed to achieve its military objectives.
The Cambodia incursion was a prime example of how even a tactical victory could backfire strategically.
So it seems like the U.S. was caught in a trap of its own making. They escalated the war in an attempt to force a victory, but that escalation only made things worse, leading to more casualties, more instability, and ultimately a loss of public support.
It's a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding the complexities of foreign interventions.
Now let's shift gears and talk about presidential legacies. The lecture dives into some of the debates surrounding the decisions made by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Let's start with Kennedy. Would he have pulled out of Vietnam if he hadn't been assassinated?
It's one of those enduring what-if questions that historians love to debate. Some argue that Kennedy was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the war and was looking for a way out. They point to his reluctance to commit large numbers of ground troops and his private expressions of doubt about the U.S. ability to win.
But others argue that his staunch anti-communism and his belief in the domino theory suggest he would have continued to escalate U.S. involvement, especially given the political climate of the time.
It's a counterfactual, so we can't say for certain what he would have done. But it's a fascinating question that highlights the complexities of historical analysis and the enduring fascination with Kennedy's presidency.
Then there's Johnson. He's often seen as the president who owned the Vietnam War, the one who oversaw the massive escalation of U.S. involvement. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, he certainly made the fateful decision to commit hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to the conflict. It was under his watch that the war reached its peak in terms of troop deployments and casualties. He pursued a strategy of attrition that proved ultimately unsuccessful.
So while he didn't start the war, he dramatically escalated it, and his presidency became synonymous with the conflict and its escalating costs.
Exactly. And he bore the brunt of the political fallout as public opinion turned against the war. He faced growing opposition from within his own party, from the anti-war movement, and from the American public at large. The Vietnam War became a major factor in his decision not to seek re-election in 1968.
And finally, Nixon. He came in promising peace with honor, but he also expanded the war into Cambodia and continued the bombing of North Vietnam. How do historians view his role in the conflict?
It's complicated. He's both praised and criticized for his handling of the war. On the one hand, he did eventually negotiate the Paris peace accords, which allowed for the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
But on the other hand, his decisions to bomb Cambodia and intensify the air war are seen as reckless and ultimately counterproductive. And as we discussed, his strategy of Vietnamization didn't pan out as planned.
Right. The South Vietnamese army, despite extensive U.S. training and support, proved unable to resist the North Vietnamese onslaught. The fall of Saigon, just 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal, cast a long shadow over Nixon's legacy in Vietnam.
So each of these presidents faced their own unique challenges and made decisions that shaped the course of the war. It's fascinating to see how their individual personalities, their advisors, and the political climate of their times influenced their approaches to this complex and intractable conflict. But I'm curious, what overarching lessons can we draw from the U.S. involvement in Vietnam? What insights can we glean from this tumultuous chapter in American history?
The Vietnam War offers a wealth of lessons, some of them quite sobering. One of the most significant takeaways is the danger of underestimating your opponent. The U.S. repeatedly misjudged the resolve and capabilities of both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. It's a reminder that military might alone does not guarantee victory, especially when you're facing a determined enemy fighting on their home turf.
It also highlights the importance of understanding the local context, the cultural and political landscape of the place where you're intervening. The U.S. seemed to struggle with this in Vietnam, often prioritizing anti-communism over understanding the nuances of Vietnamese society and the aspirations of its people.
That's a crucial point. The U.S. backed a series of governments in South Vietnam that lacked legitimacy and popular support. This made it incredibly difficult to build a sustainable, independent nation that could resist communist influence. It's a classic case of failing to win the hearts and minds of the people.
We've talked a lot about the failures of U.S. military strategy in Vietnam, the reliance on conventional tactics, the massive bombing campaigns, the expansion of the war into Cambodia. All of these proved ineffective in the long run. But what about the role of public opinion? The lecture mentions that growing anti-war sentiment in the U.S. played a significant role in the eventual withdrawal of troops.
Absolutely. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, and the images of the conflict, the casualties, the protests back home, all of this had a profound impact on public perception. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a turning point. It was a major military setback for the U.S., and though a tactical defeat for the communists, it really shook public confidence in the war effort.
It seems like the Vietnam War really exposed a disconnect between the government's narrative about the war and the reality on the ground.
It did. The government was portraying the war as a fight against communist aggression, but the reality was far more complex and messy. The anti-war movement, fueled by images of the conflict and growing skepticism about the government's motives, gained momentum throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s.
So the Vietnam War was not just a military and political failure, it was also a failure to maintain public support for a protracted and costly conflict.
Precisely. And that has had a lasting impact on the way the U.S. approaches foreign interventions.
The lecture concludes with a thought-provoking question. It asks how the legacy of the Vietnam War continues to shape U.S. foreign policy today. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a question that deserves careful consideration. The Vietnam War serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of hubris, of underestimating our adversaries, of getting bogged down in unwinnable conflicts. It's also a reminder of the importance of public support and the need to clearly articulate the goals and justifications for military intervention.
It makes you wonder how those lessons have been applied, or perhaps misapplied, in subsequent U.S. military interventions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, share some striking parallels with Vietnam. The challenges of fighting insurgencies, the difficulty of nation-building, the toll on public opinion, these are all themes that resonate with the Vietnam experience.
They certainly do. The legacy of Vietnam continues to loom large in the American psyche, shaping our debates about foreign policy, the use of military force, and the role of the U.S. in a complex and ever-changing world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, delving into the complexities of the Vietnam War, from Eisenhower's early involvement to Nixon's attempts to extricate the U.S. from the conflict. We've examined the strategies, the missteps, the political machinations, and the human cost of this pivotal chapter in American history.
It's a story that continues to fascinate and challenge us, offering valuable lessons about the limits of power, the perils of intervention, and the enduring importance of understanding the past to navigate the present and future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Vietnam War. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to delve deeper into the sources, and to consider how the lessons of this conflict resonate with contemporary challenges. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.